The 10th anniversary of the Vita is coming up soon, and so I wanted to do a video that I know is a topic people have covered before, about why the Vita failed. I wanted to give my views on it, because I think people mainly focus on memory cards, but I think there's more going on than just the memory cards. Before I get into the video, just a quick little plug for the Kickstarter for my book, Vita Means Life. This is a 400-page hardcover book covering the entire life of the Vita, which I'm writing. The Kickstarter is up and running right now. If you're watching this after the Kickstarter is finished, then you may be able to pre-order it from my website. I'm going to figure that out later. But if you're in time for the Kickstarter, the link is in the description, so go check that out. So, why did the Vita fail? I think there are 8 reasons. I've got 8 reasons that I've listed down. And so I'll go through each one of these. The first one, I think, is design. So the Vita feels great to hold, great buttons. I think it's a console that I could hold for a long period of time and enjoy playing and not kind of have my hand cramping up, as some consoles do. It feels comfortable to hold. I love the feel of the buttons. The screen is awesome, especially the OLED screen. I think Sony did a really good job with the design generally. I think there are a few mistakes they made though. I think firstly, lack of L2 and R2. That should have been there. They didn't put those trigger buttons in. And that just meant that when it comes to something like remote play, it's never going to be quite as good as using a controller because you're using the touchscreen or the back touch, or you need to get kind of an accessory to use the R2, L2 buttons, triggers, which is just not as great. They should have put those triggers on there. I think they kind of wasted space on the Vita with the back touch and the front camera and the back camera. There are very few games that used any of those features to a useful degree. Tearaway is a good example where, you know, the back touch and camera were used in the game. I wasn't a huge fan of Tearaway, but, you know, they did use it in novel ways at least. I did like how Wipeout 2048, when you win a race, you can take a picture of yourself with the front camera. So those are little things that were quite good, but generally those features were wasted. You know, I do like that Sony was trying to innovate, do something different, but I think they shouldn't have bothered. They should have just tried to make a machine for gamers. And instead of having those features in there, they should have had, like I said, the R2, L2, and which brings me to my second point, they should have had onboard storage. So a big reason for the Vita failing is the memory cards. They costed so much. And especially in Japan, when the Vita was launching, when it was announced, the memory card prices for 32 gigs was something like $120, which is just crazy for a 32 gig memory card. And even though the prices came down when it came to the US and the UK, the damage was already done. The Vita had a reputation for having really overpriced memory cards, which put people off. And some games required you to have that memory card. And so it really hurt the optics of the device, that suddenly you have to pay an extra $100 or whatever it would be, just to have that storage. Instead of that, linked to kind of the design topic, they should have put onboard storage, maybe 8 gigs, 16 gigs, something. You know, the PSP Go, which came out a few years earlier than the Vita, that had 16 gigs of storage. They should have done the same with the Vita so that people weren't forced to buy these memory cards. The Vita Slim had 1 gig of storage, but that's nothing. No one even thinks about that. That's not enough to really house any proper games, or any AAA games. They should have put a much more storage in there. If they're going to charge people so much money, then put 16 gigs in there so people aren't forced to buy those memory cards up front. And if they had maybe removed the back touch and the front and back camera, maybe they could have put the memory cards in there instead. Obviously, we'll never know, but it's just really hurt the Vita from the very offset to have those memory cards priced so high. And I think it's something that, based on the design, memory cards, you know, Nintendo must have seen that and said, well, actually for the Switch, we're not going to have any cameras. We're not going to put a back touch. We're just going to keep it as a proper games machine with the front touch screen, because I think people are used to that now. It's easy to navigate the store and everything with it. But I think Sony really made a mistake, kind of the design, and then not putting the memory cards inside the actual Vita, and then charging people so much money for those memory cards. I think the next area that really hurt the Vita was the lack of games, or the perception of lack of games. The Vita has loads of games. its launch was amazing. There was about 24 games when the Vita launched. It had a great selection of games as well. So you had, things like FIFA, Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3. So you had this kind of big third-party titles. Then you had Uncharted, Wipeout. You had some great indie games in there like Mutant Blobs, Escape Plan, Super Stardust. There were great games there for the launch. I think what hurt it, especially for the Western release, is that when the Vita launched, it had 24 games, or 26 games, I think it was in the UK. There were no games for another 4 weeks after that. I believe it was 4 weeks where there was no games, and then for the 8 weeks after the Vita launched, there was only 2 games. So 2 games launched in 8 weeks after a new device has come out. Yes, there were 24 games. Yes, there was so much to play from the launch library, but it just looked bad. It just looked like, wait a minute, I bought this device and there are no new games coming. Where are the games? When are the new games coming out? I think Sony should have maybe made the launch of, say, 14 games, and then every week had a new game come out. Then at least they would have been a bit more spaced out. It wouldn't have had that reputation for having no games. And I think, again, this is something that other systems since the Vita have learned from. The PS4, PS5, Xbox One, Switch, they have had a steady stream of games. So when the Switch launched, it didn't have that many games coming out each week initially, but it had something coming out every week. There was always something to look at the store for. Now there's too many games coming out each week to even kind of go through them. But at the time, the Switch at least had a steady stream, and the Vita really needed that. Even if they had, delayed, say, Plants vs. Zombies or Mutant Blobs to come out the week after or 2 weeks after, it would have just helped, I think, the look of the system, that there are games coming out. And I think it may have helped the games as well. It's, when there's so many games released in one go, it's hard to actually pay attention to them, and you may miss some good games. So Mutant Blobs, I didn't play that till months after the Vita's launch. I kind of fell under my radar because I had Motorstorm, Uncharted, Wipeout. I played it later and loved it. But I think if it had had its own kind of week to shine on the PlayStation Store where nothing else was coming out for the Vita, I think games like that would have done much better. And speaking of no games or lack of games, the next reason is support from Sony. And I feel like Sony they stopped very quickly in terms of supporting the Vita. They had games obviously coming out in 2012, 2013, we had Soul Sacrifice, Killzone. But going into 2014, we had Orishika and Freedom Wars. And that was pretty much it. We had Soul Sacrifice Delta as well, but we didn't have that many games coming out from Sony. And I think that sends a message to other games publishers like Activision or EA. And it says, well, Sony doesn't have confidence in this thing to support it. So why should we? Why should any other company support the Vita if the publisher's not going to support it? And so I think that really hurt it as well. You saw that Nintendo, the 3DS wasn't doing well at first either, but they doubled down. They really kind of pushed out games. They kept supporting it, and it did really well in the end. And I think Sony just gave up far too quickly, and so it just meant that the system, it just seemed like there was no games, and it seemed like if anyone was going to release big games in the system, it had to be Sony. They had to be the ones to show that big games could sell on the Vita. But they didn't. They gave up on it really quickly, which was a real shame. And I think it just sent a bad message to the whole industry. I think Sony also didn't support the Vita and especially the PS TV enough when it comes to advertising. And, I think I've spoken about this in a previous video, but the PS TV, I think, is a great device. And it's a real missed opportunity, in my opinion, for Sony. They released the PlayStation Classic a few years later, but the PS TV could do so much more than the PlayStation Classic, and they were selling it for a good price. It was £80 in the UK. The PlayStation Classic was £70. It was such a good deal, the PlayStation TV. It could play PS1 games, PSP games, and a lot of PS Vita games. There were some. That was probably one of the problems with the PS TV design as well, that it didn't play everything, and there was kind of mixed messaging about what it could and couldn't play. But the PS TV just wasn't advertised enough. I feel like if you had sent out the message in the mainstream media a bit more that, there is a device, it's really cheap, you can play it, with your, 2-player, you can go back and play games from your childhood, from PlayStation 1, like Metal Gear, like Final Fantasy 7. That kind of messaging would probably help lapsed gamers. Some of my friends who haven't played games in years or who had fond memories of the PlayStation 1, may think, hey, £80 or $100, why not? Let me go and buy this PSTV and just play a few more games from my childhood. I think that was a missed opportunity as well. They just didn't support it enough with advertising and really getting the message out there. Next topic, smartphones. And I think this is a genuine one. The Sony did make mistakes with the Vita. Like I said, design, memory cards, support. But I think smartphones did have an impact on it. When the Vita came out, smartphones were everywhere. People were playing games on their smartphones. A dedicated handheld was less useful. Now, the Switch has shown that actually handhelds can still shine and still thrive. But I think the Switch Nintendo's done great with the Switch. They've done a really good job with advertising it, with supporting it. And it's got that right balance between being that kind of console and handheld, which has worked for a lot of people. I think it's also the timing of it, because smartphones were becoming more and more prevalent around the time of the Vita. And so the games from smartphones, everyone was playing them, and people were having fun with these little games. I think probably when the Switch came out, people realized actually a lot of the games on smartphones are a bit rubbish. They're a bit manipulative with the free-to-play mechanics. And so, a dedicated handheld like the Switch has done really well from people realizing that smartphone games aren't what they want. Whereas at the time of the Vita, smartphones were still seen as a good thing, and those games were still seen as growing. It was a growing marketplace, and so it did impact the Vita. And it did impact the 3DS as well. So the DS sold 110 million, I think, units, whereas the 3DS was about 60 to 70 million. And so you can see there that there was an impact on the 3DS as well. The handheld market generally for the Vita and 3DS generation shrunk massively from 70 million PSP and 110 million DSs to around 20 million Vitas and about 60 to 70 million 3DSs. So it did have a big impact. I think, even my kids were playing on their iPads, playing on the phones, because that was just kind of easier and more convenient than necessarily going out and buying a dedicated handheld. So yeah, I think that did have a big impact as well. The next item I think that had an impact was Sony setting expectations about the Vita itself. They messaged it that this is a console system on the go, or a console in a handheld. The games would be console quality games on the go. And I think they delivered pretty much, but I think it also set the expectations in the media that we would be getting something more from the Vita. And so, there are a few examples like that. I think Borderlands 2 is an example where the media expected Borderlands 2 on a handheld. Now, the Vita is obviously not as powerful as the PS3, but I think that expectation meant that when it actually came out, it reviewed really badly because it did have glitches. It wasn't as polished as the console version. And so, it hurt the Vita in terms of games being reviewed badly, the media thinking that they're going to be getting something more from the Vita than what they're actually getting. And I think that's media's fault as well, to be honest, because I remember reviews for Need for Speed Most Wanted as well, where they were more negative on the Vita than the PS3. But the Vita version is the more impressive version. I mean, the fact that you've got that game, like a whole massive console game running on the Vita, yes, it had less traffic, but I think the expectations that you're getting the exact same game as the PS3 were incorrect or were just not set appropriately. I think maybe Sony should have said that this is a PS2 and a half, rather than closer to PS3. And so you're going to get some big budget games that are very close to, more than what you would have got for PS2, close to what you get for PS3, but this is still ultimately a handheld. And I think the media kind of didn't understand that, because you could see that from the reviews of games, of Borderlands 2, of Need for Speed Most Wanted, of Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation, where there was an expectation that you're getting an exact console game, where I think because it is a handheld, it's not going to be as powerful. You're not getting the same thing as what the consoles had. So I think it's Sony setting expectations maybe wrongly, and the media's expectations being a bit kind of unrealistic and not being quite fair. And I think that translated to player expectations as well, thinking that this is going to be some, incredible, PS3 in your hands, essentially. I think Nintendo doesn't get enough credit for how they managed the competition with the Vita. When Sony announced the price of the Vita, and it was pretty much the same price as the 3DS, so Nintendo obviously, panicked, and they did the price drop of the 3DS, and that really hurt the Vita. Suddenly, the Vita was around a third more expensive than the 3DS, which, even though the 3DS, it's, in my opinion, is not as good a device, it didn't feel as comfortable to hold, they couldn't play as complex games as the Vita. That price drop really hurt the Vita, because everyone thought the Vita's price was great when it was first announced, but suddenly it was like, okay, 3DS has dropped price, and there was kind of an expectation that maybe Sony would drop the price. I think Nintendo kind of sowed that seed of doubt in the Vita whether the price was actually good by doing their own price drop. And then the 3DS was criticized for having no games, or for having very few games when it first launched. But I think what Nintendo did for the Japanese launch of the Vita was actually masterful. It was a genius idea. So the 3 weeks before the Vita launched in Japan, Nintendo released Super Mario 3D World, Mario Kart, and Monster Hunter 3 on the 3DS. So one each week leading up to the Vita's launch. It completely overshadowed the Vita. The 3DS was selling like hundreds of thousands of units every week. Those games were selling hundreds of thousands of units every week. Nintendo released its 3 biggest games for the 3DS in the 3 weeks before the Vita launch, and really overshadowed the Vita. And it just damaged the Vita's reputation after that. And I think it's also, Sony hurt themselves with the memory card price, because in Japan, you could buy a Nintendo 3DS and all those 3 games for the same price as a Vita and I think it was an 8 gig memory card. So you're getting a device with 3 games for the same price as just buying the Vita and a small, very tiny memory card. That was a really good move by Nintendo. You guys know, I love my Vita, but they did the right thing for their company, and Sony couldn't and didn't respond. The thing they could have done maybe was dropping the price of the memory cards, but they didn't. And that may have just helped them out at launch, but they didn't do it. And so that approach by Nintendo that really damaged the Vita, I think, comes to the last reason why I think the Vita did badly, which was a very bad Japanese launch. Now, the initial sales from week 1 were strong. It was something like 370,000 units sold in that first week, which is great. That's a good number. It's better than the PSP got. So it was a very strong first week showing. But it did less well than the 3DS. The 3DS had been out for nearly a year, but with those 3 games I mentioned launched beforehand, before the Vita came out, the 3DS sold better than the Vita in the Vita's launch week, which is never a good sign. And then the weeks following the Vita's launch, the sales plummeted. They went down to around 40,000 about 2 or 3 weeks after its launch, whereas the 3DS was still selling in hundreds of thousands. The PSP was selling more than the Vita in the few weeks after the Vita's launch, which again is not a great sign. It just made the device look like there was something wrong. It was a problem. Sony also bought, Sony stocked more of the 3G Vitas than they did the Wi-Fi Vita. And the 3G Vita was more expensive. And so what it meant is that a lot of people who wanted the Wi-Fi Vita just didn't bother picking up the 3G Vita either. And so there were images in Japan of Vitas being left on store shelves. And so the Vita just had this perception that it's not selling well, it's not performing well. And suddenly it had the reputation, okay, this device is not doing well in Japan. Japan is a market that likes handheld gamings. If the Vita is not going to sell there, then it's going to be doing badly here. And I think it kind of snowballed from there, that the Vita is not doing well, and it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the Vita looks like it's not selling well, and so publishers say, well, I'm not going to make games for it. The Vita gets a reputation for having no games, and so it doesn't sell well, and it just kind of keeps snowballing from there. I think the Vita just got trapped in this cycle where it almost couldn't win. I think you needed Sony to intervene and do something drastic to change the Vita's fortunes, and they just didn't do enough. What I would have liked to have seen Sony done is spoken to, Rockstar Games, and maybe they did do this. Look, I don't know. But, if they'd spoken to Rockstar Games and said, we just want your permission to port Grand Theft Auto 3, Vice City, San Andreas to the Vita so that they'd be ready for the Vita's launch or the Vita's holiday season. I think that would have made a big deal. Having those 3 games on a proper handheld with controls, it would have been a big deal for the Vita sales. I think the Call of Duty Black Ops Declassified, when it launched, that should have been a much bigger deal. That should have had a huge impact on the Vita sales. And it did sell well. It did help the Vita sell. But its reviews were so bad that it still ended up damaging the reputation of the Vita. It made the Vita look, again, like a system with no good games, which is such a shame. I think Sony should have done more in that respect, just investing in the Vita and trying to get more of these third parties to port their games over to the Vita. And maybe they did, and we just don't know about it. Maybe there was lots going on behind the scenes. But that's kind of, I think, the thing that's missing. More games, and more games like the Grand Theft Auto games that people would have bought the system for. So yeah, I think those are my 8 reasons, guys, why I think the Vita failed. Those are probably the main ones. I'd love to hear your opinions. Is there anything else that you think really caused the Vita to not sell well? In the end, it sold estimated around 15 to 20 million, which is not bad, but it clearly wasn't enough for Sony. I feel like Sony, unless they have a device that is kind of doing really well, they just stop supporting it. I mean, the PS VR, that didn't sell massively. The Vita sold better than PSVR, but I think because it was the #1 VR device, Sony was happy to keep supporting it. Whereas Vita was obviously #2 to the Switch. It didn't have the perception of doing well, so Sony just abandoned it really early, which was a real shame. A real shame. I think the device was so capable, and we can see that now. When it comes to the homebrew developers, they're putting out some amazing stuff. There is ports of Bully, of the Grand Theft Auto PS2 games. There's so much there that's kind of coming from these homebrew developers, so much they've been able to achieve that Sony wasn't able to achieve. And so I think Sony could have done a lot more. They should have done a lot more. So I think ultimately the blame lies with them. But I think the market, with smartphones and Nintendo just having a great strategy to counter the Vita, I think that had a big impact on the Vita as well. So guys, let me know in the comments, what are your views? What do you think caused the real failure of the Vita? Leave a comment below, and as always, thanks for watching.